No emperor, king, or president has ever controlled a nation. Not really. Not in the way we imagine it. One mind, one will, reaching directly into millions of lives. What they controlled was something quieter and far more effective. A chain. A chain of people who controlled other people. Who controlled other people, until eventually, several links down, someone controlled you. This is the part that gets left out of most history. We picture power as a spotlight. The ruler stands at the center, and everything else is illuminated by his presence. But that's not how it worked, and it's not how it works now. Power at scale has never been about one person reaching everyone. It's been about building a structure where he never has to. Strip away the throne, the crown, the palace, and what's left is an engineering problem. How do you move a single decision, made in one room, across a distance of 1,000 miles, through people who speak different languages, worship different gods, and will never once see your face, and have it arrive intact? That problem has a design, and once you can see it, you can't stop seeing it everywhere. Before you can understand how rulers solve this problem, you have to understand how brutal it actually was. In the ancient world, a message traveled only as fast as a horse, a ship, or a pair of legs. A command issued in a capital city might take weeks to reach a distant province. And by the time it arrived, the situation on the ground had often already changed. An uprising could rise and fall before the ruler even heard it had started. Distance wasn't just inconvenient. It was dangerous. Every mile between the ruler and his subjects was a mile where his authority could be questioned, reinterpreted, or ignored outright. Because who was going to stop them? The man on the throne wasn't there. He wasn't anywhere nearby. And an empire that depended on his physical presence to function would have collapsed within a single season. So the ambitious rulers, the ones whose names survived for centuries, stopped trying to solve the distance problem by shrinking it. They solved it by designing around it entirely. They accepted a hard truth. They would never personally govern their empire. And once they accepted that, a much stranger idea became available to them. If you can't be everywhere, you can still make people feel like you are. That single shift from presence to perception is where the real architecture of power begins. Here's the part that reverses almost everything we assume about power. The rulers who lasted the longest were often the ones people saw the least. Think about it from the other direction. A ruler who is constantly visible, eating in public, arguing in the street, making ordinary mistakes in front of ordinary people, starts to look like an ordinary person. Familiarity doesn't just breed contempt, it breeds calculation. People start measuring him, comparing him, wondering if they could do his job better. But a ruler who is rarely seen and only appears through ritual, ceremony, or carefully staged moments, surrounded by gold, silence, or distance, stops being measured as a person at all. He becomes something closer to a symbol, and symbols don't get challenged the way people do. This is why so many courts, across entirely unconnected civilizations, arrived at the same instinct: seclusion. Veils, elevated thrones, palace walls, controlled audiences, ritualized silence. Not out of vanity, as strategy, every layer of separation between the ruler and the ruled wasn't a loss of connection. It was a deliberate transfer of power from the man to the myth surrounding him. Because a myth doesn't need to be everywhere in person. A myth already lives in the imagination of everyone who's heard of it. And imagination, unlike a human body, has no travel time at all. This is the first piece of the architecture. Absence, engineered correctly, doesn't weaken control. It concentrates it. Myth alone doesn't collect taxes, settle disputes, or move an army. For that, power needed something more tangible than imagination. It needed people, but not a direct line of people reporting to the ruler himself. Something smarter. What emerges again and again across empires that had no contact with one another is the same basic structure: layers. The ruler doesn't govern the population. He governs a small circle of governors. Each governor doesn't govern their entire province directly. They govern a smaller circle of regional officials. Those officials govern local administrators who govern village leaders who finally govern the people whose names the ruler will never know. Notice what this structure actually solves. At no point does anyone in this chain need to control more than the layer directly beneath them. The ruler controls a handful of governors. Each governor controls a handful of officials. Nobody in the entire system needs the impossible skill of managing millions of individual relationships, because the system was never built on relationships. It was built on layers of manageable obedience, stacked on top of each other until they added up to an empire. And this is what made the structure so durable. You could remove the ruler entirely, through death, illness, or absence, and the layers beneath him would often keep functioning on their own, at least for a while, because each layer had learned to answer to the layer above it, not to the man at the very top. The ruler wasn't the engine of the empire. He was the reason the engine existed. Those are not the same thing. Human networks were powerful, but they still had a weakness. People get tired, people get bribed, people die. So the most durable rulers built a second system alongside the human one. A system that never needed sleep, never asked for a raise, and never questioned an order. They ruled through objects. A coin stamped with a ruler's face didn't just pay for bread. Every time it changed hands, it silently repeated a message. This is who is in charge here. It traveled to villages the ruler would never visit, sat in the pockets of people who would never hear his voice, and did the work of 1,000 messengers without any of them ever leaving the treasury. Law codes did something similar. Once a ruler's judgment was written down and copied, it no longer needed him present to be enforced. A local magistrate, hundreds of miles away, could apply the rulers while using nothing but a scroll. Religious sanction went even further. When rulers linked their authority to something sacred, obedience stopped being a political choice and became something closer to a spiritual obligation, enforced not by soldiers, but by conscience. This is the second piece of the architecture. Symbols, currency, law, imagery, ceremony, sacred endorsement. All of it functioned as a kind of infrastructure, quietly carrying the ruler's authority into rooms he would never enter, embedding his presence into objects that people touched every single day. He didn't need to be everywhere. He only needed his symbols to be everywhere for him. Here's the question this raises. With no police force capable of watching millions of people, and a ruler who was, for most subjects, a rumor more than a reality, why did the system hold? Why didn't it collapse the moment nobody was looking? Because, in most cases, nobody needed to be looking. The deepest trick of the entire architecture wasn't the chain of officials, and it wasn't the symbols. It was what those two things produced together, a population that policed itself. When authority feels legitimate, sanctioned by tradition, religion, or simple inevitability, people don't obey because they fear getting caught. They obey because disobedience feels, to them, almost unthinkable. The order isn't external anymore. It's internal. This is far cheaper than fear, and far more durable. An empire that rules through terror needs constant enforcement. And enforcement is expensive: soldiers, informants, garrisons in every town. An empire that rules through legitimacy needs almost none of that, because the subjects themselves become the enforcement. A merchant who quietly underreports a tax isn't stopped by a soldier. He's stopped by his neighbor's disapproval, by the local elder's judgment, by his own sense of what is owed and to whom. Surveillance doesn't scale. Belief does. And that is the quiet, uncomfortable truth sitting underneath most of history's largest empires. The ruler most people never met was, in a very real sense, living inside their heads. Not because he put himself there, but because the architecture around him made sure he never had to leave. None of this ended when empires did. It just changed its materials. A multinational corporation governs employees across 100 countries who will never meet its CEO. Through layered management, branded symbols, and a culture people begin to police in themselves. A modern state governs citizens through officials, currency, law, and civic ritual that function exactly like the relay systems of old, just faster. Even a platform you scroll through every day governs your attention through the same basic logic. A distant, mostly invisible authority translated downward through interfaces, incentives, and rules you rarely question because they feel less like control and more like the way things simply are. The names changed. The materials changed. Parchment became policy. Coins became currency markets. Temples became headquarters. But the underlying architecture is nearly identical to the one built thousands of years ago. Distance engineered into mystique, authority translated through layers, belief doing the work that force never could sustain alone. We tend to search for power in the loudest place, the person with the title, the face on the currency, the name on the building. But power was never really there. It was in a chain nobody sees. History likes to remember faces, the emperor, the president, the founder. But faces fade, and titles get rewritten within a generation. What tends to survive far longer is something far less dramatic. The structure underneath, the layers of delegated trust, the symbols that carried authority into rooms no ruler ever entered. The quiet, internal agreement of ordinary people to go along with a system they never fully chose. That structure doesn't need a headline. It doesn't need a name people remember. It only needs to keep functioning long enough that nobody thinks to ask who built it or why it still stands. Look past the person at the center of any age, and you'll usually find the same thing waiting underneath. Not a villain, not a hero, just an architecture that learned how to outlast whoever was currently standing on top of it.